You're standing at an estate sale in the Pennsylvania hills when you spot it. A row of mysterious iron and wood tools on a folding table, but nobody knows what they actually do. These aren't decorations or keepsakes. They're functional relics that have stumped collectors for decades. You pick one up. It is heavy. It has a handle worn smooth by 1,000 mornings of use. There are teeth on it, or a curve, or a hinge you cannot make sense of. You turn it over. Nothing. The tag just says old tool, $2. This video is about those tools. 10 of them. The ones nobody can identify anymore. The ones that did the quiet, essential work of building this country, and then simply vanished. Number 10. We start at the bottom of the list with something that sounds almost medical, and in some ways it was. The Fleam. If you have ever found a small, folding multi-bladed instrument that looks a little like a pocket knife, but with thick, triangular, chisel-edged blades instead of a cutting edge, you may have held a Fleam without knowing it. Farmers and livestock keepers across early America used the Fleam to perform a procedure called bloodletting on their animals. The belief, stretching back centuries through European folk medicine, was that sick cattle or horses carried bad blood that needed to be let out. The Fleam would be pressed against a vein in the animal's neck and struck sharply with a small mallet called a bloodstick. One well-documented example is the Thomas Turner Fleam made in Sheffield, England, but widely imported and sold through American mercantile shops throughout the 1700s and into the early 1800s. Veterinary science eventually caught up with the reality that bloodletting was doing more harm than good, and by the latter half of the 1800s the practice had largely faded. The Fleam stayed behind, sitting in old leather kits in barn drawers, making almost no sense to the grandchildren who found them. Number 9. Now we move from the barn into the kitchen, because not all the forgotten tools were from the trades. The box iron is a wonderful example of domestic ingenuity from an era before electricity. It looked something like a modern clothes iron, but it was hollow. The base was a hinged metal shell, and inside it you would slide a solid iron slug that had been heating in the fireplace. The housewife of the 1700s or early 1800s would lift the slug out with a separate handle, drop it into the box, latch it shut, and then have a smooth, continuously hot ironing surface without the open flame or the soot that came with the older style of sad irons heated directly on the stove. One particularly well-preserved example survives at Colonial Williamsburg, showing the elegant dovetail latch on the back. By the mid-1800s, the sad iron with detachable handles had improved enough to make the box iron obsolete, and once electric irons arrived in the early 1900s, even the memory of it began to fade. Number 8. Sugar nippers. The very name sounds like something out of a fairy tale, and yet these were a serious, necessary piece of equipment in almost every American household before refined granulated sugar became widely available. Sugar in the colonial and early republic period came in the form of a hard, compressed cone called a sugar loaf, sometimes weighing as much as 9 or 10 pounds. To get usable sugar, you needed to break pieces off, and that required sugar nippers. They looked like a heavy pair of pliers or a small bolt cutter, with thick curved jaws and long lever handles to concentrate force. A household would keep their sugar loaf wrapped in blue paper in the pantry, and when they needed sugar for a pudding or a tea, they would reach for the nippers, snap off the needed amount, and then pound it fine with a mortar. Industrial sugar refining in the latter 1800s ended the age of the sugar loaf almost completely, and with it went the nippers, leaving behind only the odd pair that turns up in an antique shop with no explanation. Now pause here for just a moment, because I want to ask you something. Did your grandfather have any of these hanging in his shed? Or your grandmother in her kitchen? Leave me a comment below. You might be surprised how many other people in this community have the same piece sitting on their shelf right now with no idea what it is. Number 7. The Bobbin Winder. In the age of the hand loom, before every yard of cloth came off an industrial machine, the bobbin winder was the unsung workhorse of the weaving room. It was a small, wooden, hand-cranked device that transferred thread from a skein or a large spool onto the small bobbins that fed the shuttle of the loom. Without it, the weaver would spend as much time fighting tangled thread as actually weaving. Many bobbin winders were made at home by local carpenters and never matched any standard pattern, which is part of why they are so hard to identify today. The introduction of factory-woven cloth beginning in earnest after the 1820s gradually stripped the hand loom from the domestic world, and the Bobbin Winder went with it into attics and then into silence. Number 6. The Cherry Stoner. This one is a small delight. By the 1860s and 1870s, American kitchen supply companies were producing cast-iron cherry stoners that clamped to the edge of a table and processed cherries with satisfying mechanical precision. You fed a cherry into a cup, pressed a lever, and a plunger shot the pit straight through into a separate container while the cherry fell clean into a bowl. The Enterprise Manufacturing Company of Philadelphia produced one of the most well-known models, a beautiful little machine with a painted finish and a hopper that could process a bowl of cherries in a fraction of the time it took to do it by hand. When commercial canned pie filling arrived and the culture of home preserving declined through the mid-20th century, the cherry stoner became a relic. They survive in great numbers at flea markets, usually mistaken for some kind of small meat grinder. Number 5. The grass hook. Not to be confused with a sickle, which is a harvesting blade for grain. The grass hook was a shorter, lighter, one-handed blade with a reversed curve and a wooden or bone handle, used for trimming grass in tight corners near fence posts or stone walls where a scythe could not reach. It was the detailed tool of the farm, patient and quiet work for the end of a long morning. By the time the rotary push mower became affordable for most American households around the 1890s and into the early 1900s, the grass hook had already begun its slow retreat, and the gasoline lawn mower finished the job. Number 4. The Spokeshave. Here is one that some woodworkers will still recognize, but in its antique hand-forged form, most people walk right past it. A Spokeshave is a two-handled cutting tool with a short blade set between the handles, designed to shave and shape curved wooden surfaces, the spokes of wagon wheels being the original application. The wheelwright would grip both handles, draw the blade along a rough spoke of oak or ash, and coax it to a smooth, even taper. One celebrated design was the cast-iron Spokeshave introduced by the Preston Company in the late 1800s, which allowed for fine blade adjustment. Machine-made wheels, and then the automobile age ended the wheelwright trade, and the Spokeshave retreated into the hands of chair makers and boat builders, and then mostly out of living memory. Number 3. The Straw Splitter. Straw hat weaving was a cottage industry across New England and the mid-Atlantic states from the late 1700s well into the 1800s, and the straw splitter made it possible. It was a small cylindrical or conical device with radiating blades inside, sometimes made from a hollowed bone or turned wood with inserted iron tines. You pushed a dried rice straw through the center, and the blades split it into 4, 6, or 8 even strips for weaving. The Dunstable hat industry in Massachusetts employed thousands of women and children in this trade at its height. When inexpensive imported straw goods arrived from Asia and the Italian trade after mid-century, the American cottage industry collapsed, and the little straw splitter became genuinely mysterious to everyone who found one. Number 2. The Niddy Noddy. The name alone deserves a moment of appreciation. The Niddy Noddy was a handheld yarn winder used by spinners after the wheel to wind freshly spun yarn into a skein of measurable length. It had a central shaft with crossbars at each end set at 90 degrees to each other, so that as you rocked it through the air in a figure-8 motion, the yarn wrapped into a consistent loop. A standard Niddy Noddy wound a skein of roughly 2 yards per pass. They were carved from a single piece of wood by hand, and no two were ever quite the same. The wool and flax industries moved to the mill, and the Niddy Noddy became an artifact so obscure that even the name began to sound like something invented. And that brings us to number 1. The most puzzling, the most menacing-looking, and the most important forgotten tool on this entire list. The Hetchel. Sometimes spelled hackle or heckle depending on the region. The Hetchel was an absolute essential of the flax-to-linen process that clothed early America. It looked, honestly, like an instrument of punishment. A wooden board, sometimes mounted on legs, with a dense field of long, sharp iron spikes, sometimes dozens of them, rising several inches from the surface. The flax worker, usually a woman or older girl, would take a bundle of ret flax, the raw plant fiber that had been soaking and rotting in controlled water to loosen the woody core, and pull it through those spikes repeatedly, drawing out the short tangles and leaving behind the long, clean, lustrous fibers ready for the spinning wheel. The Hetchel was brutal on the hands, brutal on the lungs from the flying fiber dust, and absolutely non-negotiable if you wanted linen cloth. George Washington's Mount Vernon estate records document the use of Hetchels and the organized flax processing that kept the plantation clothed. When imported cotton and then industrial looms made homespun linen unnecessary, the Hetchel retired from American life completely. Today you can find them leaning against barn walls or hanging as folk art curiosities, those iron spikes a little rusty, the wood a little dark, with no one left who remembers the sound they made on a cold morning in the fiber room. Every single one of these tools was, in its time, as ordinary and necessary as a screwdriver or a pair of scissors. Someone made them by hand, used them until they wore smooth, and handed them down, never imagining that within a generation or two they would become complete mysteries. The hands that held these tools built the food and the fabric and the furniture and the fields of this country, and they deserve to be remembered by name. Drop your guess in the comments and subscribe for a new forgotten tool every day. There is always one more story in the toolbox.